obviously in the last few months, I think particularly we've seen a lot of companies kind of move away from unconscious biases training, citing that it doesn't work, and I think that's happened on both sides of the ocean, to be honest. So question for everybody, but particularly you, I think, Bendita, is why do you think that is? Do you think the training is effective in itself? And what do you think the future of the training is?
I think that in many of our societies, we rush to action before fully understanding what we're doing, or we rush to the next thing. So I was involved in an LGBTQ plus race discussion in February, and someone asked the question, what goes beyond allyship? And I was like, have we gotten allyship yet? Like, I don't know if we've even gotten allyship yet. And we're trying to get to the next thing. So I think there's a little bit about our cultures that tries to rush to do the next thing. But I think implicit bias training is incredibly powerful, but it's frustrating for people because they don't necessarily carry that feeling of awareness to them to action. And so I think that there are some very easy changes and adaptations that can be made to help give people guidance. But oftentimes with almost any training, as a coach, that training alone doesn't do it. And actually we like to call it awareness, right? Because training is what you choose to do as an individual every single day. Awareness is what happens in these one-time sessions. The training is putting it into practice. And so it really is on each and every one of us to take what we've learned and try to develop our own systems and interruptions. And so I hope that implicit bias training will be, continue to be available for people. People will continue to undertake it. I hope that it will also include elements of microaggressions or interactional bias training as well, because I think that additional knowledge is really important. But I think we're a bit premature as a society to say it doesn't work because we haven't routed out, hundreds of thousands of years of oppression after a 60-minute session.
I mean, a lot of that I agree with. When I think of when I started in the role, unconscious bias training was one of the first things we rolled out. And I have to say, for all the criticisms of unconscious bias, it was very impactful to at least get some conversation going around diversity and inclusion. I think it's a safer way in because actually people are curious about what goes on in their minds, how their judgment, decision making can be impacted. Rather than if you said, why don't you come to equality training? We know that has very different connotations. But I think what's absolutely paramount is that you've got to have a culture and processes that reinforce what you learn. There's no point doing unconscious bias training in isolation and not doing anything else. I mean, our personal journey in our company was first do unconscious bias training. Now we're doing inclusive leadership. Followed by psychological safety and allyship as a sort of curriculum of education. But you've also got to have the practices and processes put in place that reinforce or reduce bias. So very simple ones, panel interviews. Is there diversity on the panel interview? Do you use diverse slates as a principle? Do you make flexible working the kind of default rather than optional? Do you say pay is negotiable, or do you just have transparent pay equity processes that remove biases? I sort of feel bias lives where there's ambiguity in your processes as well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
I think one of the issues with unconscious bias training is people think after they've done it that that's all they have to do. So nothing changes because it's like, okay, I've got a bias. Well, so what? Unless you're actually prepared to do something about it, prepared to make a change, and prepared to learn how to overcome that bias. Having unconscious bias training doesn't do anything but make it a conscious bias. And that doesn't help anybody, and it doesn't impact on the change that we need. So I would agree with both of my co-speakers that at this point, I wouldn't move away from unconscious bias training, but it has to be with something else. There has to be more to it. We have to be answering okay, I've identified a bias, what am I going to do about it? And people need to be in the right headspace to even start to think about what am I going to do about it? Or it just becomes another thing that I attended rather than something I've learned from and I've incorporated into the way that I'm working, in the way that I'm trying to impact on this race journey.